"Your Grace, your wife has endangered every family on this coast." Lady Lenora Crewe laid a tide chart upon the long oak table, smoothing its creases with one pale hand. Around her, the Ravenshaw tenants stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the vaulted ceiling of the county assembly hall. Fishermen smelled of salt and tar. Marsh farmers carried mud on their boots. Every face turned toward Beatrice. Duke Nathaniel Ravenshaw studied the chart without looking at his wife. In his dark blue tailcoat and silver waistcoat, he appeared composed enough to pass judgment upon a stranger. "This bears your initials," he said. "It bears an imitation of them." Beatrice stepped forward, copper-red hair gleaming beneath the candles. Her teal and ivory gown had been chosen for a tenant's supper, not a trial. Yet Nathaniel had transformed the gathering before she entered the room. Magistrates now occupied the musicians' platform. Felix Crewe stood beside the estate solicitor, one hand resting upon a leather portfolio. Lenora pointed to a column of figures. The eastern gate was declared sound 3 weeks ago. "Yesterday, my brother's inspector discovered cracks in its foundation. Repairs were paid for, but apparently never completed." A murmur moved through the hall. Beatrice did not examine the figures first. She studied the small lunar diagram in the chart's upper corner. "This report claims the inspection occurred during a waning crescent," she said. "There was a full moon that night." Felix's confident smile tightened. Beatrice turned the chart toward Nathaniel. The tides recorded here could not have occurred on the dates written beside them. Whoever fabricated this consulted an old table and neglected to compare it with this year's almanac. Nathaniel's gaze settled upon the contradiction. For one suspended moment, Beatrice saw uncertainty disturb his cold expression. 6 years earlier, he would have asked her to explain. He would have followed her onto the sea wall in the rain and watched her measure the pressure against the sluice doors. But Ravenshaw's shipping losses had grown severe, and Felix had offered enough capital to keep Nathaniel's creditors from London. Doubt had become a luxury her husband believed he could no longer afford. "The question of the moon does not account for the missing money," Nathaniel said. "Nor does an incorrect chart prove I took it. I gave you an opportunity to surrender the coastal ledgers privately. You ordered me to confess privately." His jaw hardened, "And you refused, because I am innocent." Nathaniel picked up the accusation prepared by the magistrates. Beatrice saw where his thumb rested above the signature line. "Do not sign that document," she said. "Send 2 men to the eastern gauge. Have them examine the locking plate and the foundation. By sunset, I can prove this report false." Felix leaned toward the Duke. By sunset, she could remove whatever evidence remains. Nathaniel glanced at Beatrice's iron key, suspended from a narrow chain at her waist. It had belonged to her father, who had designed 3 of Ravenshaw's 5 floodgates. Only Beatrice and the chief gatekeeper understood every mark engraved along its shaft. "You have been warned about the consequences of obstruction," Nathaniel said. "And you have been warned about trusting people who profit from finding the coast unsafe." The silence that followed felt sharper than shouting. Nathaniel signed. The scratch of his pen seemed to cross the entire hall. By that act, Beatrice was removed from the coastal office, forbidden from entering the marsh villages, and ordered to surrender every engineering record in her possession. Nathaniel then appointed Felix temporary commissioner of the flood defenses. The punishment was not merely social. Without access to the gates, Beatrice could no longer protect the 300 families living below the spring tide line. A constable approached her. "The key, Your Grace." Beatrice looked at Nathaniel once more. "You know Felix requested control of the marshlands before these charges appeared. I know he offered Ravenshaw the help you could not provide. No, he offered you money. I offered you the truth." She removed the iron key and placed it upon the table. Nathaniel's eyes followed it, but he said nothing. As Beatrice turned away, Lenora adjusted one velvet cuff. A faint line of blue crystals clung beneath the fabric. Beatrice recognized the substance immediately. Her father had developed the dye to expose unauthorized entry into the tide gauges. Once the glass chamber was opened, the powder marked the intruder's skin and clothing for several days. Lenora had touched the eastern gauge before Nathaniel granted her access. Beatrice concealed her realization and walked through the watching crowd. Public accusations required public answers, but she would first need evidence that Felix could neither purchase nor destroy. The assembly doors opened before she reached them. A fisherman stumbled inside, soaked to the chest and bleeding from one temple. "The marsh bells," he gasped. "All 3 villages are ringing them." Beatrice stopped. The evening tide was still 2 hours away. "The sea wall has broken," one magistrate said. The fisherman shook his head. "The wall is standing. The gates are open." Panic erupted across the hall. Farmers surged toward the doors while mothers called for their children. Nathaniel began issuing orders, but his voice vanished beneath the uproar. Beatrice seized the fisherman's arm. "Which gate opened first?" "East, Your Grace, then North Barrow." Nathaniel came toward her. "How quickly will the lower fields flood?" She looked past him at the iron key now held by Felix's crew. "They should not be flooding at all," she said. "Those gates cannot open together unless someone raised them deliberately." A distant church bell sounded once, then again. Beatrice counted each strike. It was not the ordinary flood warning. It was the old evacuation signal her father had devised for a complete failure of the coastal system. Across the hall, Lenora looked at Felix, not with surprise, but expectation. Beatrice finally understood what her humiliation had accomplished. Nathaniel had not merely removed her authority. He had delivered the entire Ravenshaw coast into the hands of the people preparing to drown it. Nathaniel had not merely removed Beatrice's authority. He had delivered the entire Ravenshaw coast into the hands of the people preparing to drown it. The realization struck with the third toll of the evacuation bell, but Beatrice allowed herself no time to feel it. "Thomas, how deep was the water when you crossed North Barrow Road?" she asked the bleeding fisherman. "To my knees near the chapel, Your Grace. Higher beyond the willow markers." Beatrice calculated the rate of advance. The present tide should have been falling. Without incoming pressure, the released water ought to spread slowly across the drainage channels. If it had already reached the chapel, someone had not merely raised the gates. Someone had blocked the inland sluices that carried excess water back toward the estuary. "The western embankment will hold for less than an hour," she said. "After that, the water will reach Lower Mere." Nathaniel seized his coat from a servant. "I will send riders to close the gates." "With what instructions?" Beatrice demanded. "Felix now commands the defenses, and the men who opened those gates may be wearing Ravenshaw livery." Felix stepped forward, his expression sharpened by insult. "My inspectors arrived only this morning." "Then why was blue gauge dye on your sister's cuff before you received the keys?" Lenora's hand disappeared behind the folds of her plum-colored skirt. Nathaniel saw the movement. His eyes narrowed, but his hesitation lasted only a moment. "This is neither the time nor place for another accusation." "No," Beatrice replied. "It is the time to prevent 3 villages from drowning." She turned to the frightened tenants. "Everyone from Lower Mere must take the chalk road to St. Aldwyn's Hill. Do not use the marsh causeway. The southern drainage ditch will overflow first." Several farmers obeyed at once, but a magistrate blocked the doors. "The Duchess has been suspended from coastal authority. Then you may remain here and debate my title while the water reaches your windows," Beatrice said. The magistrate moved. Nathaniel caught her arm as she passed him. His grip was firm but not cruel, and that almost made the betrayal worse. "You are forbidden from entering the marsh villages. A prohibition written before the gates were opened cannot save the people beyond them. If you interfere with the mechanisms, any further failure will be attributed to you. You have already attributed it to me." His hand loosened. Beatrice pulled free and followed the tenants into the courtyard. The Ravenshaw horses had been brought around, but Felix's men occupied the saddles. Their grey coats bore newly stitched estate badges, too clean for men who claimed to have inspected muddy gates that morning. Beatrice chose an old chestnut mare from a farmer's cart and mounted without waiting for assistance. Nathaniel swung onto his black gelding beside her. "You cannot intend to follow me," she said. "They are my villages. They were your villages when you signed away the person who knew how to protect them." His face tightened. "I signed an accusation, not a death warrant. We shall discover whether the sea recognizes the distinction." They rode east with Thomas and 6 fishermen. Behind them, Felix issued different orders to his inspectors and sent 2 riders north. Beatrice marked their route, but could not pursue them. The church bells were growing louder. Water glittered across the fields in the moonlight, turning hedges into black islands. Families hurried uphill carrying blankets, bread, and sleeping children. Beatrice stopped beside an elderly widow struggling with a handcart and helped lift the woman's grandson onto Thomas's horse. Nathaniel watched the villagers call Beatrice by name. These were not people who regarded her as a distant duchess. She knew which cottages housed invalids, which farmer kept a boat behind his barn, and which families would refuse to abandon their animals unless someone forced them. "Mrs. Bell has twins and cannot walk far," she told Nathaniel. "Send 1 rider to the red-roofed cottage. Old Matthew Crow is deaf. Someone must enter his house rather than shout from the road." Nathaniel dispatched his own groom, then looked at her with an expression she could not interpret. "You prepared an evacuation list. After the spring tide of 1812, you called it unnecessary." The answer silenced him. They reached the eastern gauge 20 minutes later. The stone tower stood above swirling water, its door hanging open. No guard remained at the post. Beatrice dismounted and examined the lock without touching it. The brass face was undamaged. Whoever entered had possessed a key. Inside, the glass chamber had been removed from the tide column, explaining the blue dye on Lenora's clothing. But the gate wheel had not been forced. A removable iron tooth had been fitted between 2 gears, holding the mechanism open. Nathaniel raised his lantern. "Can you close it?" "Not until the pressure falls. Turning the wheel now would break the main shaft and leave the gate open through tomorrow's spring tide." "Then how do we stop the water?" "We divert it through the old relief channel." Beatrice pointed toward a low ridge beyond the tower. "My father built a secondary sluice beneath that embankment, but your late steward sealed it 15 years ago." "Why?" "Because the channel crosses land Felix Crew purchased last month." Nathaniel stared across the flooded darkness. The purchase had been presented as a harmless investment in salt pasture. Beatrice could see him fitting this new fact against the warning he had refused to hear. "What do you need?" he asked. 20 laborers, spades, ropes, and the original engineering book from my study." His expression changed. "Felix's inspectors removed your records this afternoon." Beatrice looked at him. "On whose authority?" Nathaniel did not answer. He did not need to. By transferring her office, he had given Felix legal access to every plan required to sabotage Ravenshaw's defenses. A shout came from inside the gauge tower. Thomas emerged carrying a broken lantern and a strip of blue cloth. "There is someone behind the lower gears." Beatrice took Nathaniel's lantern and entered. A young gatekeeper lay wedged against the stone wall, his temple bloodied but his chest still moving. His fingers were closed around a small brass token marked with the crest of the Royal Land Commission. Beatrice knew that token. Government surveyors carried them when inspecting property intended for compulsory purchase. The commission was not due at Ravenshaw for another month. The gatekeeper opened his eyes and clutched her wrist. "They changed the date," he whispered. "The commissioners arrive at dawn. Crew means to show them the village is empty and the marsh already ruined." Then a flash of orange appeared through the tower window. Flames rose on the western ridge, directly above the sealed relief channel. Someone was burning the only embankment Beatrice could open. Someone was burning the only embankment Beatrice could open to save Lower Mere. She ran from the gauge tower before Nathaniel could stop her, gathering her skirts as she crossed the flooded track toward the western ridge. Thomas and 2 fishermen followed, while Nathaniel ordered his groom to remain with the injured gatekeeper and then overtook her on horseback. The flames did not spread like an accidental grass fire. They burned in 3 straight lines across the ridge, each positioned above one of the buried relief conduits. "Oil trenches," Beatrice said. "They are not trying to destroy the embankment. They are keeping us away from it until the water rises." Nathaniel dismounted beside her. "Can we extinguish them?" "Not in time. We must open the central conduit from below." She led the men along the flooded boundary until they reached an abandoned drainage hut, half concealed by reeds. Her father had once shown her the maintenance shaft beneath its floor, but the door now carried a new iron lock. Nathaniel raised a stone to break it. "Wait." Beatrice knelt and examined the ground. 2 sets of boot prints led inside, while narrow wheel tracks continued toward the Crew salt pasture. Between them lay a small wooden tally, stamped with the number 17 and stained with blue copying ink. She wrapped it in her handkerchief without touching the surface. "What is it?" Nathaniel asked. "A labor token. Marsh workers exchange these for wages, but Ravenshaw has not issued wooden tallies in 8 years. Then it could have washed here from anywhere. It is dry beneath the ink." She placed it inside her reticule. It was dropped after the water reached this path. Nathaniel looked toward the flames. He had noticed the contradiction, yet urgency gave him a reason to postpone what it meant. He smashed the lock, and they entered the hut. Beneath the rotting floorboards, Beatrice found the maintenance shaft intact, but someone had removed the original lifting chain and replaced it with a new rope already fraying under strain. If they pulled it from above, it would snap before the buried sluice opened. "They expected us to find this," she said. "The false rope would make the relief gate appear jammed." Thomas lifted his lantern over the shaft. "Can a man climb down?" "Not safely. The chamber may already be filling." Beatrice removed her gloves and tested the rope fibers. They smelled faintly of linseed oil, the same substance feeding the fire outside. A freshly tied knot joined the rope to an older chain below. It was not a sailor's knot or a laborer's hitch, but a decorative double loop commonly used on carriage luggage. Beatrice had seen that knot earlier in the evening, fastening Felix Crew's leather portfolio. Nathaniel recognized it as well. She saw the knowledge in the sudden stillness of his face. "Felix employs dozens of men," he said. "One of them may have tied it, and one of them may have borrowed his hands." She cut away the weakened length, then turned to Thomas. "I need the trace chain from your boat. The boat is half a mile east. Then take the chain from His Grace's saddle harness." Nathaniel glanced toward his gelding. That harness was made to restrain a horse, not lift a floodgate. "My father designed the relief gate with a counterweight. Once the first iron tooth moves, water pressure will complete the opening. The chain need only survive one pull." Nathaniel drew his knife and cut the harness himself. Together, the fishermen fed the leather-bound chain through the shaft, while Beatrice guided it across the upper wheel. The first attempt failed. The mechanism groaned but did not rise. Water seeped between the floorboards. "Again," Beatrice ordered. "If it breaks," Nathaniel began. "Then Lower Mere is lost. Pull." All 5 men leaned backward. The chain stretched, leather tearing from its links. For several seconds nothing moved. Then a deep metallic blow sounded beneath them, followed by the roar of water entering the forgotten channel. The hut shuddered. Outside, the flooded field changed direction, retreating from the village road and pouring toward Crew's pasture. The flames along the ridge hissed as water burst through the soil beneath them. Thomas laughed once in disbelief. "You have turned it." "Only the central conduit," Beatrice said. "It will protect Lower Mere, but North Barrow remains exposed." Nathaniel watched water sweep across land Felix had purchased. "You knew opening this channel would flood Crew's property." "I knew the original drainage agreement prohibited permanent buildings on that pasture because it formed part of the emergency spillway. Felix built 2 warehouses there, without my approval. That is why he needed me removed." A distant crash rolled across the marsh. One of the warehouses tilted as water struck its foundation. Its doors burst outward, releasing dozens of sealed barrels into the channel. Several bore the crew shipping mark, but one split against a stone and scattered iron components across the shallows. New floodgate teeth identical to the piece jamming the eastern mechanism. Nathaniel stepped into the water and recovered one. He told me the warehouses contained imported salt. Then either he deceived you, or someone used his property without his knowledge. Beatrice's restraint made the accusation more dangerous than anger. Nathaniel turned the iron tooth in his hand. This proves the parts were stored on his land. It does not prove he ordered the gates opened. No, that will require the ledgers you allowed him to remove. Hoofbeats approached before Nathaniel could answer. 4 riders emerged through the smoke, led by Felix's crew. Lady Lenora rode beside him in a dark cloak, her stained cuff now hidden beneath black gloves. Felix surveyed his collapsing warehouse and the water pouring across his newly purchased pasture. His composure vanished. "What have you done?" he shouted. "Opened a lawful relief channel to save Ravenshaw tenants," Beatrice replied. "You have destroyed private property while suspended from office, property constructed illegally upon an emergency spillway." Felix looked toward Nathaniel. "Your Grace, you witnessed this. She has used the disaster she created to attack my investment." Nathaniel held up the iron mechanism recovered from the warehouse. Why were these stored among barrels declared as salt? Felix's eyes moved from the floodgate tooth to the wooden tally barely visible inside Beatrice's open reticule. For the first time, he did not look at her as a disgraced wife or an inconvenient woman. He looked at her as the only person capable of reconstructing what he had done. "Those components were commissioned for coastal repairs," he said carefully. "The relevant invoices are in Ravenshaw Hall." Lenora guided her horse closer to Beatrice. "Then we should all return and examine them before further damage is done." "North Barrow is still flooding," Beatrice said. "I am not returning anywhere until its families are safe." Lenora's smile remained serene, but her gloved fingers tightened around the reins. Behind her, one of Felix's riders quietly turned his horse toward Ravenshaw Hall and disappeared into the smoke. Beatrice understood the order he had received without hearing it: reach her study before she did, and destroy whatever the crews had failed to remove. At that moment, the injured gatekeeper's groom galloped toward them from the eastern tower, shouting that the witness had regained consciousness and named the man who struck him. Before he could reach Beatrice, a rifle cracked from beyond the burning ridge, and the groom pitched forward from his saddle. Before the groom struck the flooded ground, Beatrice was already running toward him. His horse bolted into the reeds, but Thomas caught its reins while Nathaniel and 2 fishermen dragged the fallen man behind the stone wall of the drainage hut. Blood spread across his right shoulder rather than his chest, and Beatrice found the bullet's path by pressing carefully along the torn cloth. "It passed through," she said. "Keep him upright and bind both wounds." Nathaniel removed his cravat and handed it to her without speaking. Beatrice folded it against the groom's back, then ordered one fisherman to maintain pressure while she searched the burning ridge. The marksman had fired from behind a line of blackthorn bushes, overlooking both the relief channel and the road from the eastern tower. A mounted figure disappeared beyond the flames before Nathaniel's men could reach him. Felix drew his pistol, though the danger had already passed. "This proves the saboteurs are desperate to silence anyone connected to the gates," he declared, "and Lady Beatrice has been alone with the injured gatekeeper." Beatrice looked at him across the wounded groom. "Your men occupied the horses outside the assembly hall. Your rider departed for Ravenshaw Hall moments before the shot. If you wish to accuse someone, begin by accounting for every servant wearing your new estate badge." Felix's face darkened. "You possess no authority to question my men." "Then His Grace may question them." Nathaniel turned to Felix. "Bring every inspector to the eastern tower. No one leaves the marsh without my permission." Lenora urged her horse closer. "Nathaniel, North Barrow is still in danger. Surely your men are better used rescuing tenants than pursuing accusations based upon panic. Beatrice heard what lay beneath the reasonable words. Lenora needed Felix's riders dispersed before Nathaniel could count them. "Thomas, take the wounded man to St. Aldwyn's," Beatrice said. "Use the chalk road and send the parish surgeon to the eastern tower. The gatekeeper must not remain alone." Thomas hesitated. "And you, your grace?" "I am going to North Barrow." Nathaniel rose. "You cannot ride there through the lower road." "I do not intend to. The old shepherd's path crosses the high peat." Felix laughed. "That path ended years ago, only on the new estate maps." Beatrice mounted the chestnut mare and looked directly at Nathaniel. "The original route is marked in the engineering book your commissioner removed from my study. If Felix has truly examined those records, he should know it." Felix's silence lasted half a heartbeat too long, Nathaniel noticed. Again, however, he chose immediate action over judgment. "Lead us," he ordered. Beatrice guided Nathaniel, Lenora, Felix, and 8 fishermen away from the burning spillway. The shepherd's path appeared no wider than a dark seam through the heather, but the ground beneath it had been packed with shells and gravel when her father constructed the northern gate. On either side, water-concealed peat holes deep enough to swallow a horse. Beatrice tested each bend with a fallen branch before permitting the others to follow. Halfway across, Lenora's mare slipped from the packed road. Beatrice caught the bridle and forced the animal's head toward solid ground. For one instant, Lenora's gloved hand closed around Beatrice's wrist. Blue powder marked the seam between glove and sleeve, brighter now that rain had dampened the fabric. "You should have let me fall," Lenora whispered. "Then Felix would tell everyone I murdered you." Beatrice pulled the mare upright. "I would rather see you answer questions." They reached North Barrow as water entered the first cottages. The northern gate remained open, but unlike the eastern mechanism, its wheel turned freely. Someone had cut the counterweight loose and sunk it in the channel. Closing the gate by hand would require more strength than the village possessed. Beatrice examined the current, the angle of the chain, and the wooden footbridge spanning the sluice. "Remove the bridge rails," she ordered. "We will use them as levers." Felix stepped between her and the villagers. "The Duchess is suspended. My engineers will direct the repair." His men produced ropes and attached them to the gate wheel, but Beatrice saw at once that they had tied the lines to the outer rim. Under pressure, the wheel would splinter before the gate moved. "Stop!" she shouted. Felix raised his arm. "Pull." Beatrice seized an axe from a fisherman and severed the nearest rope. It snapped back hard enough to throw 2 men into the mud. "Another turn would have broken the wheel," she said. "Then the gate could not be closed even after the tide changed." Felix pointed at the ruined rope. "She has sabotaged the operation before witnesses." Nathaniel stepped toward her, anger and doubt fighting visibly across his face. "Can your method close it? If the central shaft is intact, and if it is not, then I will have destroyed nothing that Felix's method would not already have destroyed." She directed the villagers to place the bridge rails through the inner spokes, wrap the remaining chain around the stone capstan, and move together on her count. Women joined the fishermen. Even older children carried stones to brace the base. Beatrice stood ankle-deep in the channel, watching the gate's lower edge. Now, the first pull moved it less than an inch. The second brought a groan from beneath the water. On the third, the iron gate descended far enough for the current to seize it. The sluice slammed closed, throwing spray over everyone on the bank. A cheer rose from the villagers. Felix immediately mounted the capstan and called for his inspectors to secure the mechanism, presenting himself as though he had completed the rescue. When a local magistrate arrived, Lenora told him that Felix's quick leadership had saved North Barrow, despite Beatrice's reckless interference. Several frightened tenants believed her. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to oppose the man who now controlled their leases. Only 12-year-old Ruth Bell, the gatekeeper's daughter, stepped forward. "Lady Beatrice showed us where to place the rails," she said. "Mr. Crewe tried to pull the wheel apart." Felix dismissed her as a frightened child, but Beatrice knelt beside Ruth. "Where is your mother?" "At the Eastern Tower with father. Before he was struck, he gave me this, and told me to hide it." Ruth drew a narrow strip of waxed paper from inside her boot. It was not a letter, but the torn edge of a delivery receipt, bearing 3 numbers, a crown-shaped customs stamp, and Felix's signature beneath an order for mechanical parts. The remaining portion had been removed, yet Beatrice recognized the numbers as the stamped measurements of Floodgate teeth. Nathaniel took the paper. He now possessed a direct reason to compare Felix's invoices with the components recovered from the warehouse. "We return to Ravenshaw Hall," he said. "Tonight." Felix's expression remained controlled, but Lenora's did not. "The commissioners arrive at dawn," she reminded him. "Then the truth must be established before they do." Nathaniel looked at Beatrice. "You will be present when the records are opened." It was the first chance he had accepted to verify her warning, though he had offered it only after villages flooded and a man was shot. Beatrice did not mistake delayed fairness for trust. When they reached Ravenshaw Hall shortly before midnight, smoke curled from the chimney above her private study. The door stood locked, and the servant guarding it wore Felix's new badge. Nathaniel ordered him aside, broke the seal, and entered with Beatrice at his shoulder. Her shelves had been emptied, her papers thrown into the hearth, and her father's engineering book lay open upon the desk, instead of burning with the rest. Lenora reached the doorway and went perfectly still. A page had been folded back to reveal a handwritten list of payments, each apparently authorized by Beatrice, and each bearing the same impossible lunar date she had exposed at the hearing. Nathaniel touched the ink, then looked toward the untouched inkwell on Beatrice's desk. "This page is still wet," he said. From behind the curtains came the faint scrape of a shoe. Nathaniel crossed the room in 3 strides and tore the heavy velvet aside, revealing a young copying clerk crouched against the window recess, with blue ink on his fingers and Beatrice's silver paper knife clenched in one hand. The clerk could not have been more than 19. His face had gone grey with terror, and a newly stitched Ravenshaw badge hung crookedly from his coat. Nathaniel dragged him into the light. "Who ordered you to write in this book?" The young man's eyes moved first toward Felix, then toward Lenora. Felix's expression did not change, but he placed one hand inside his coat as though touching a concealed weapon or letter. "Her Grace did," the clerk whispered. "The Duchess instructed me to add the payments before the commissioners arrived." Beatrice stepped closer to the desk. "What is my full name?" "Lady Beatrice Ravenshaw." "And what did I call this book when I gave it to you?" The clerk hesitated. "The Coastal Account. It is an engineering register. There has never been a payment recorded in it." She pointed to the wet page. "You copied figures without understanding where you placed them." Lenora entered the study, her black gloves now replaced by a clean pair. A frightened subordinate may misuse a word without lying. Then he may describe when and where I gave the order. The clerk swallowed. "Yesterday afternoon, in this room." Beatrice lifted the scorched edge of a curtain. "Yesterday afternoon I was at North Barrow with 12 tenants repairing the chapel drainage ditch. Nathaniel received my written report before dinner." Nathaniel remembered. His gaze shifted toward the document tray, where that report ought to have remained. It was gone. Felix produced a folded paper from his portfolio. "Perhaps this will settle the matter." The clerk's written instructions were found among the Duchess's correspondence. The note bore Beatrice's initials and ordered £3,000 transferred through Crew Shipping for emergency gate replacements. Nathaniel read it twice. "The hand resembles yours, because it was copied from the tide reports removed from my office." Beatrice held the paper near the candle without touching the flame. "My household notes are written on cream linen paper, bearing my father's compass watermark. This sheet carries the Ravenshaw Raven. It came from your private writing room." Nathaniel angled the page until the watermark appeared. His mouth hardened. Felix answered before he could speak. "Any member of this household could obtain ducal stationery." That proves nothing about who dictated the words. It proves the note was not found among my private correspondence, unless someone placed it there. Beatrice turned to the clerk. Show us your left cuff. Terror widened his eyes. He tried to retreat, but Nathaniel caught his arm and pulled back the sleeve. Blue dye had soaked through the cloth. Unlike writing ink, the crystals glittered beneath the candlelight. The same gauge powder that stained Lenora's gown marked the clerk's skin. He opened the Eastern instrument, Beatrice said, or assisted the person who did. The young man broke. I never opened it. Mr. Pell gave me the glass chamber after he returned from the marsh. I was told to clean it and copy whatever Mr. Crewe placed before me. Felix's head snapped toward him. There is no Mr. Pell in my service. A man called Pell received wooden tally 17, Beatrice said, removing the token from her reticule. The tally dropped beside the drainage hut. Ask your new laborers which of them carries the matching wage list. Nathaniel now possessed the wet forgery, the stained clerk, the Crewe parts recovered from the flooded warehouse, and the torn receipt signed by Felix. Every path pointed away from Beatrice. Yet before he could order the doors secured, hurried footsteps sounded in the corridor. The Ravenshaw solicitor entered with 2 creditors, and Sir Edmund Vane, the senior county magistrate. Sir Edmund's cloak was powdered with road dust. Your Grace, forgive the hour, but the Land Commission has advanced its inspection. Its representatives are less than 3 miles away. Felix recovered his composure. Then we must execute the emergency concession immediately. The solicitor opened a prepared deed. It granted Crewe Shipping a 30-year lease over the unentailed salt marshes, warehouses, gate roads, and wharfage rights in exchange for paying Nathaniel's most urgent debts. A second document appointed Felix sole coastal commissioner until the flood inquiry concluded. You told me the concession would not be required unless the banks refused an extension, Nathaniel said. One creditor placed 3 protested bills upon the desk. The extension expired at midnight, Your Grace. If the debts are not secured before the Commission records the flooding, we shall petition for the seizure of all unentailed Ravenshaw income. Beatrice understood the trap. Felix had engineered the disaster to lower the coastal land's value, then arranged to acquire its controlling lease as the only man offering immediate credit. The commissioners would see flooded villages, damaged gates, and a suspended duchess accused of mismanagement. Nathaniel had been maneuvered into providing the one element the scheme still lacked, his lawful signature. Do not sign, she said. The relief channel destroyed one warehouse, but the recovered mechanisms and Ruth's receipt are enough to delay any concession until the county court examines them. Felix pointed toward the clerk. The boy has accused you, and the papers bear your hand. Every hour of delay increases the estate's losses. Your Grace must choose between Ravenshaw and the wife who has brought it to ruin. You know that is false, Beatrice said to Nathaniel. You saw the wet ink. You saw Felix's components. You heard the clerk name another man. Nathaniel looked at her, and for the first time that night his doubt resembled shame. But then he looked at the protested bills, the waiting magistrate, and the estate seal. Ravenshaw had been in his family for 4 centuries. Felix had built his plan around the certainty that Nathaniel would sacrifice anything before allowing the family name to fall publicly into debt, including the woman who had spent 6 years protecting it. If I delay, and you are guilty, the entire estate will be lost, Nathaniel said. If you sign and I am innocent, you will hand the coast to the man who framed me. I cannot stake thousands of lives upon my private feelings for you. This is not about your feelings. It is about evidence you are choosing not to examine. Sir Edmund cleared his throat. The commissioners cannot be kept waiting, Your Grace. Nathaniel took up the pen. Beatrice's last hope for the marriage did not vanish when he touched it to the paper. It vanished when he paused, met her eyes, and signed, despite knowing there was reason to doubt. He granted Felix control of the gates, roads, warehouses, and coastal leases. At Felix's request, Nathaniel also swore a formal complaint, accusing Beatrice of financial fraud and interference with flood defences. Sir Edmund ordered her confined to the west wing of Ravenshaw Hall, pending examination. Nathaniel sealed the deed. The moment the wax hardened, Felix ceased pretending humility. "Remove Lady Beatrice's keys and search her rooms." "You already removed them," Beatrice said. "Then search again." 2 constables approached, but Beatrice raised one hand. "I will go without force. Ruth Bell and her father are to remain under the parish surgeon's protection, not yours. The wounded groom must be guarded by men who served Ravenshaw before tonight." Nathaniel nodded. "It will be done. And the wooden tally remains with Sir Edmund." She gave the token to the magistrate, preserving at least one piece of evidence outside Felix's custody. Nathaniel stepped toward her. "Beatrice, you made your choice. Do not soften it by speaking my name." As the constables escorted her from the study, she heard Felix instruct the solicitor to prepare notices terminating the marsh tenants' leases for failure to maintain inhabitable land. That was the larger act his forged disaster enabled. By dawn, hundreds of displaced families would be declared in breach, their farms absorbed into the Crewe concession before they could return. Beatrice no longer intended to save her marriage. She would protect the villagers, expose Felix, and secure an independent future beyond Nathaniel's authority. At the West Wing staircase, Ruth Bell emerged from a servant's passage and pressed something into Beatrice's palm before the constables noticed. It was a second wooden tally, numbered 17 like the first, but stamped on its reverse with a London auction house and tomorrow's date. Beneath the mark were 3 words, scratched by Ruth's injured father: "Sale of Ravenshaw Marsh." Beneath the mark were 3 words scratched by Ruth's injured father: "Sale of Ravenshaw Marsh." Beatrice closed her hand around the tally before the constables noticed and allowed them to lock her inside the west drawing room, where tall windows overlooked the road leading toward the coast. Dawn was still 2 hours away, yet wagons already moved below, carrying Felix's clerks, measuring poles, and stacks of printed notices toward the flooded villages. The concession Nathaniel had signed gave Felix the appearance of lawful authority, and the disaster supplied the excuse to use it immediately. Beatrice examined the room for another exit. The windows had been painted shut, the fireplace was too narrow, and a constable stood beyond each door. Felix had chosen the room carefully. He had overlooked only one fact. For 6 years, Beatrice had supervised every repair in Ravenshaw Hall. She knew that the west drawing room shared an old speaking vent with the servants' linen closet. She removed the brass cover with a hairpin and whispered Ruth's name into the dark opening. A few minutes later, the child answered from the other side. "I am here, Your Grace. Listen carefully. Find Thomas and tell him the marsh is not being sold by ordinary auction. The matching tally means Felix is using labor tokens as bidder passes. Anyone carrying number 17 belongs to the same purchasing company, no matter what name he gives." "Where will the sale take place?" "The old customs warehouse. The London stamp identifies Halden and Pike, an auction house licensed for distressed shipping property, not agricultural leases. Felix intends to disguise the farms as abandoned commercial lots." Beatrice pushed the tally through the narrow vent. "Take this to Sir Edmund. He holds its pair. Do not go alone, and do not let anyone wearing a new Ravenshaw badge see it." Ruth disappeared just as the drawing room door opened. Lenora entered with a breakfast tray and dismissed the constables to the corridor. Her plum gown had been replaced by pale grey silk, and no trace of blue dye remained upon her hands. "You should eat," she said. "The commission may question you for hours." "How considerate." Beatrice remained beside the window. "Did Felix tell you the auction house placed its mark on his wage tokens, or was that his private mistake?" Lenora's hand paused over the teapot. "You are attempting to frighten me with nonsense." "No, I am determining which part of the plan belongs to you." Beatrice watched the slight tightening around her mouth. "Felix arranged the credit. the false repairs, and the auction. You gained access to the gauge because Nathaniel trusted you inside this house, but you touched the blue chamber yourself. That was vanity. You wanted to witness the moment my authority was destroyed. Lenora poured tea without drinking it. Nathaniel destroyed your authority because he had already ceased to believe you. You exploited the fracture. He chose to widen it. Beatrice's voice remained calm. Do not mistake his guilt for your innocence. Lenora crossed to the window. Below, estate servants were fastening crew notices to carts. By noon, the commissioners will certify the coast unmanageable. By evening, Felix will control every profitable road and wharf between Ravenshaw from the sea. Nathaniel will keep his title, his house, and enough income to avoid disgrace. I will help him rebuild what remains. And what do you receive? A place he should have given me years ago. There it was. Not a confession sufficient for a court, but the motive Lenora had concealed beneath concern for the estate. She wanted Beatrice erased socially, while Felix consumed the property materially. You may occupy my rooms, Beatrice said, but you will never be able to make Nathaniel's choice honorable. Lenora's composure cracked. She set down the cup hard enough to spill tea across the tray. When the commission asks whether you falsified the tide charts, remember that your freedom may depend upon cooperation. My freedom no longer depends upon anything Nathaniel or your brother is willing to grant. Lenora left, locking the door behind her. Minutes later, bells rang in the front courtyard. 3 black carriages bearing the royal crown arrived beneath the portico. Beatrice expected commissioners, clerks, and surveyors. Instead, armed excise officers descended with a crown receiver, authorized to seize disputed coastal revenues until the flood inquiry concluded. Nathaniel met them on the steps, the sealed crew concession in his hand. From the window, Beatrice watched the receiver read it and then refused to return it. The deed's emergency clauses, drafted by Felix, did more than lease the marshes. They pledged Ravenshaw's wharf duties as security for crew's advance, revenues already assigned under an older Crown debt agreement. Nathaniel had unknowingly pledged the same income twice. The receiver immediately froze every Ravenshaw harbor account, impounded the estate's ships, and suspended Nathaniel's authority to collect coastal rents. His creditors, hearing the order, demanded payment on the remaining bills. In less than an hour, the Duke lost the income he had betrayed Beatrice to preserve. The consequence did not arrive from fate. It came directly from the signature he had refused to delay. Nathaniel entered the drawing room, without Lenora or Felix. His face had lost its rigid control, but Beatrice saw no sudden transformation in him, only the first pain of recognizing that his certainty had been purchased. The receiver says Felix's concession violates a crown assignment signed by my father, he said. Where is the original? In the blue treaty chest that stood in my office until you gave Felix permission to empty it. The chest is gone. Then you understand why he required your signature before dawn. Nathaniel looked toward the locked door. Felix has left for the customs warehouse. The commission believes he is organizing emergency leases for displaced tenants. He is auctioning their farms to members of his own company. Beatrice told him about the matching tally, but not that Ruth now carried it. Nathaniel's expression hardened. I will stop the sale. With what authority? The receiver has suspended yours, and your deed made Felix lawful commissioner. He had no answer. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel could not solve a crisis by giving an order, because the power he needed had been transferred by his own hand. You know the coast better than anyone, he said. Tell me what can be done. The Crown receiver may delay the auction if presented with evidence that the properties are occupied agricultural holdings rather than abandoned commercial lots. The parish rent rolls, baptism records, and drainage assessments would prove continuous residence. Where are they? The rent rolls were in my office. Felix has them. The parish copies are kept at St. Aldwyn's, but the lower road is underwater. The chalk road remains open, for now. At the spring tide, The eastern gate's broken shaft will allow seawater through again. The next rise begins shortly after noon. Nathaniel understood the choice she was placing before him. If he rode to the customs warehouse, he might challenge Felix but arrive without proof. If he went to St. Aldwyn's, he could secure the records but would leave the auction to proceed. "What will you do?" he asked. "Protect the tenants. I will not rescue your title or your creditors. You are confined by Sir Edmund's order." Then ask the magistrate whether he wishes 3 villages erased from the parish register while his evidence sits in this room. Nathaniel summoned Sir Edmund. The magistrate resisted until Ruth appeared with Thomas, the paired tallies, and 6 villagers willing to swear that their homes had been occupied before the flood. Faced with evidence under his own custody, Sir Edmund released Beatrice into Thomas's supervision for the limited purpose of retrieving the parish records. Nathaniel offered her a horse and armed escort. "Your men answer to Felix now," she said. "I will travel with the villagers." They departed along the chalk road as dawn broke red over the flooded marsh. Behind them, Crown officers sealed Ravenshaw Hall's counting rooms, while Felix's auction bells sounded from the coast. Halfway to St. Aldwyn's, Beatrice noticed the water rising against the roadside markers much faster than the natural tide allowed. Someone had reopened North Barrow's gate after they left. Then a rider came from the direction of the church, his horse white with foam. "Turn back!" he shouted. "St. Aldwyn's is burning. The parish chest is still inside, and the vicar is missing." "St. Aldwyn's is burning. The parish chest is still inside, and the vicar is missing." Beatrice urged the chestnut mare forward before the rider finished speaking, and the villagers followed her along the narrowing chalk road. Smoke rolled above the trees in heavy black folds, but when the church came into view, Beatrice saw that the flames were concentrated around the vestry rather than the nave. Whoever started the fire knew where the parish records were stored. Men formed a bucket line from the stone well, while women carried benches, altar cloths, and the silver communion plate into the churchyard. Thomas tried to prevent Beatrice from entering, but she wrapped a wet wool cloak around her shoulders and pointed toward a low door beside the bell tower. "The vestry passage has a stone ceiling. The roof may burn, but the corridor will hold longer." "Your father did not design churches," Thomas shouted above the crackling timbers. "No, but I paid for the vestry repairs after the winter frost split the arch." She entered with Thomas and Ruth behind her. Smoke reduced the passage to a dark tunnel. The parish chest had been dragged from its usual position and left directly beneath a burning shelf, its iron lock already heated red. Beatrice recognized the arrangement as deliberate. A thief would have removed the documents. Felix wanted them destroyed in a manner that appeared accidental. Thomas threw water across the lid, while Beatrice searched the wall beside it. Reverend Elias Moore had once shown her a recessed cavity used during the previous century to conceal parish silver. The stone panel stood open. Inside lay 3 leather registers, the drainage assessment book, and a sealed packet addressed in the vicar's hand to the Crown receiver. "He moved the true records," Beatrice said. "The chest is a decoy." Ruth found the vicar's spectacles on the floor and a dark smear across one lens. They hurt him. Hoofprints behind the vestry led toward the customs road, but Beatrice would not endanger the registers by pursuing immediately. She placed each book inside a grain sack, wrapped the sealed packet in oilcloth, and gave them to 3 different villagers rather than a single keeper. "Thomas carries the drainage assessments. Mrs. Bell takes the marriage and baptism register. Ruth, remain beside your mother with the rent book. Do not exchange them unless Sir Edmund and the Crown receiver are both present." By dividing custody and naming witnesses, she ensured Felix could not destroy the evidence with one theft or claim it had been altered in secret. They emerged moments before part of the vestry roof collapsed. In the churchyard, Beatrice examined the blackened debris clinging to her cloak. The fire smelled of the same linseed oil used on the false rope at the relief shaft. Beneath a window, she found a strip of coarse canvas stamped with half of cruise shipping's raven and anchor mark. It was suggestive but not decisive. Warehouse cloth could be stolen. More important was the fire's timing. Felix knew the parish records threatened the auction only after Beatrice explained their value to Nathaniel. Someone inside Ravenshaw Hall had carried that information to him before dawn. Nathaniel arrived with Sir Edmund and 4 Crown officers, while villagers were moving the rescued records into the schoolhouse on St. Aldwyn's Hill. He dismounted, saw the burned vestry, and looked toward Beatrice's smoke-streaked face. The vicar? Taken toward the customs road. He anticipated the fire and hid the originals. She handed the sealed packet directly to the receiver in Sir Edmund's presence. Inside were copies of 3 notices Reverend Moore had received during the previous week. Each demanded that he certify the Marsh cottages as vacant after Felix's inspectors claimed the tenants had permanently abandoned them. The vicar had refused. His final note stated that a man calling himself Josiah Pell had offered him £50 for the church seal. Nathaniel remembered the clerk's testimony. Pell gave him the gauge chamber, and wooden tally 17 was dropped near the relief shaft. Beatrice said, "If the auction bidders carry matching tokens, Pell connects the sabotage, the false vacancy certificates, and Felix's purchasing company." The Crown receiver opened the drainage assessment book. Page after page showed regular repairs completed under Beatrice's supervision, with payments drawn not from missing estate funds, but from a private allowance established by her marriage settlement. Nathaniel read the totals in silence. Over 6 years, Beatrice had spent nearly half her pin money maintaining flood channels that Ravenshaw accounts could no longer afford. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked. "I submitted the accounts each quarter. Felix said the repairs were charged twice and that you refused to explain the difference. I wrote the explanation in every report you returned unopened." Sir Edmund glanced away, embarrassed on the Duke's behalf. Nathaniel did not defend himself. The realization moved through him slowly, not as sudden absolution, but as an accumulation of failures. Beatrice had protected his tenants, concealed the estate's weakness from its enemies, and used her own lawful income to preserve land he later accused her of exploiting. "I should have read them," he said. "Yes, I should have delayed the concession. Yes." His voice lowered. "I should not have sworn the complaint against you." Beatrice met his eyes. "Regret does not restore the villages, release Reverend Moore, or cancel the authority you gave Felix. Tell me what repair is possible. Publicly withdraw your accusation before the commissioners. Admit that the evidence was disputed when you signed it. Give the receiver every private letter and debt agreement between you and Felix, including those that expose Ravenshaw's insolvency. Then renounce any claim to direct my investigation." The last condition struck him hardest. Cooperation meant accepting that Beatrice would act beyond his control and might use what she learned to leave him permanently. "And if I do," he asked, "I will permit you to help protect the witnesses." Nothing more. Nathaniel inclined his head. Agreed. The schoolhouse became Beatrice's base of action, beyond Felix's lease, and under joint parish and Crown protection. Sir Edmund stationed 2 constables at the door, while the receiver recorded the custody of every rescued register. Thomas identified 3 fishermen who had seen Josiah Pell riding with Felix's inspectors, and Ruth drew the unusual silver buckle worn by the man who struck her father. Beatrice compared her drawing to the surviving delivery receipt. Beside Felix's signature appeared a tiny stamped emblem shaped like an open compass. The same emblem marked the London auction house on the wooden tally. It was not Holden and Pike's official seal. It belonged to a private syndicate that purchased distressed coastal property through false bidders. Felix had likely used the syndicate elsewhere, leaving records beyond Ravenshaw that he could not burn. Nathaniel sent his fastest trusted groom, not one of Felix's new men, to the nearest post road, with letters for the Crown Receiver's London office and the auction house registrar. Before the rider departed, Beatrice sealed copies in separate envelopes and required Sir Edmund to note the time. By noon, she possessed a coherent chain. The matching tallies connected Pell's laborers to the false auction. The delivery receipt linked Felix to the gate parts. The blue dye connected Lenora's access to the eastern gauge, and the parish records disproved the claim that the farms were vacant. Only Reverend Moore could identify the person who demanded the false certification. A boy from the customs road arrived breathless. "The vicar is alive," he said. "They have him on the auction platform. Mr. Crewe says Reverend Moore will confirm the land was abandoned." Beatrice gathered the villagers and crown officers, but before they could leave, a stone shattered the schoolhouse window. A burning bottle landed beside the grain sack containing the rent book. Thomas smothered the flames with his coat, yet the attack drew every guard toward the rear yard. At the front door, Ruth screamed. A masked rider seized her, tore the original delivery receipt from the cord around her neck, and galloped toward the customs warehouse, with the child held across his saddle. Felix had taken both the most fragile proof and the witness who could explain where it came from. Felix had taken both the most fragile proof and the witness who could explain where it came from. Beatrice mounted before Sir Edmund finished ordering pursuit, but she refused to let panic turn Ruth's rescue into another trap. "Send 2 crown officers by the wharf road and 2 along the sea wall," she said. "Thomas rides with me. Nathaniel, take the northern causeway and watch for anyone leaving the warehouse with Reverend Moore." Nathaniel did not question her authority. They descended from St. Aldwyn's Hill toward the old customs warehouse, where carriages crowded the raised quay and auction flags snapped above the flooded marsh. The sale had already begun. Inside, Felix stood upon a timber platform beside a licensed auctioneer, presenting maps that divided the 3 villages into commercial lots. The displaced tenants had been confined behind a rope barrier, while strangers wearing numbered wooden tallies raised their hands to bid upon cottages, wharves, and pasture land. Reverend Moore sat at a clerk's table, with a bruise across his mouth and 2 crew guards behind him. Ruth stood beside Felix, one of his hands resting upon her shoulder. He had removed the receipt from her cord. "Lady Beatrice," Felix called as she entered. "You arrive in time to witness the lawful rescue of land, your negligence rendered worthless." Beatrice saw 3 exits, 6 armed crewmen, and no immediate path to Ruth. "Release the child and the vicar." Ruth came willingly after stealing documents from Ravenshaw Hall. "Reverend Moore is assisting the commission by verifying which properties were abandoned." The vicar attempted to rise, but a guard forced him down. "No tenant abandoned anything," he said. "They were driven out by the flood." Felix lifted the torn delivery receipt between 2 fingers. "Is this the document upon which your newest accusation depends?" Sir Edmund stepped forward. "Place it in my custody." "Gladly, once its authenticity is established." Felix held it over a lamp. Beatrice moved, but the nearest guard blocked her. The paper curled black and vanished into flame. Ruth cried out. Felix dropped the ash into a brass tray. A fragment obtained by a child, bearing no complete description and no witnessable chain of custody, proves nothing. "Destroying it proves you feared what it contained," Beatrice said. "Or that I refuse to let fabricated evidence disrupt a lawful auction." He signaled the auctioneer to continue. The next lot contained 12 occupied cottages and North Barrows Gate Road. 3 supposed buyers raised tallies numbered 4, 11, and 17, bidding against one another until the price appeared credible. Beatrice studied them. None displayed the excitement or hesitation of men risking their own money. They watched Felix's clerk and lifted their hands only when he touched a particular column in his ledger. The sale was theatre, but without the destroyed receipt or Ruth's uncorroborated testimony, Beatrice could not yet prove the bidders belonged to one syndicate. Nathaniel entered through the northern door with crown officers. 2 of Felix's guards reached for pistols, but Nathaniel drew first. "Remove your hand from the child." Felix's smile cooled. You granted me sole coastal authority. I did not grant you authority to abduct witnesses. Ruth Bell was found carrying stolen estate property. I brought her to a magistrate's proceeding. There is no magistrate upon that platform, Sir Edmund said. Felix released Ruth, allowing her to run to Beatrice, but he kept Reverend Moore at the clerk's table. The vicar has agreed to certify the vacancy list. Reverend Moore looked at Beatrice with helpless fury. A paper before him bore his signature, yet the parish seal beside it was an obvious impression. Beatrice recognized the flaw. St. Aldwyn's seal carried a small crack through the saint's halo, caused when it fell during the winter repairs. This impression was perfect. Felix possessed a duplicate created before the fire. She could challenge it, but Lenora entered with the 3 crown commissioners before she spoke. Dressed in mourning grey, Lenora appeared composed and concerned, as though she had come to rescue the estate from scandal. "Gentlemen," she said, "you see the chaos Lady Beatrice has created. Armed men have interrupted a sale required to house displaced tenants and preserve Ravenshaw's credit. The senior commissioner demanded order. Felix presented Nathaniel's signed concession, Beatrice's sworn accusation, the forged payment note, and Reverend Moore's false certificate. The physical evidence recovered at the warehouse had been scattered by the flood. The original delivery receipt was ash. The vicar's word was weakened by the signature obtained under threat, and the gatekeeper remained unconscious. For the first time, Felix's version formed a complete public narrative. Beatrice had mismanaged the coast, sabotaged the rescue, and pressured tenants to resist lawful relocation. The commissioners ordered the sale suspended for only 30 minutes, while they considered whether to certify it. They also warned that Beatrice might be returned to confinement for obstructing a Crown-supervised proceeding. Felix appeared to have won. Nathaniel then stepped onto the platform. "Before you decide, you must hear what I concealed." Every voice in the warehouse stopped. He surrendered his private debt agreements, protested bills, and correspondence with Felix to the Crown receiver. Ravenshaw was nearly insolvent before last night's flood. Felix Crewe offered credit in exchange for coastal control, and I allowed fear of public disgrace to govern my judgment. When evidence arose that contradicted the accusation against my wife, I refused to delay. I signed the concession, knowing the tide chart contained an impossible date, knowing ink in her register was still wet, and knowing Crewe mechanisms had been found in a warehouse falsely declared to contain salt. Lenora's face emptied of color. Nathaniel continued, though each word damaged the name he had tried to preserve. "I also swore a complaint against Beatrice Ravenshaw, without permitting a complete examination. I withdraw that accusation publicly and accept responsibility for every power my signature placed in Felix Crewe's hands." The admission destroyed Nathaniel's standing with the commissioners. They suspended him from participating in the inquiry, extended the Crown receivership over Ravenshaw's unentailed income, and warned that his concealment might be referred to the Treasury. His costly truth did not restore his authority or guarantee Beatrice's forgiveness. It merely removed the lie he had created. Yet the commissioners still refused to cancel the auction without direct proof that Felix had engineered the flood or controlled the buyers. The sale resumed under observation. Beatrice held Ruth close as one property after another passed to unfamiliar names. By noon, Felix's apparent syndicate controlled nearly every marsh lease. Reverend Moore was freed, but the false certificate remained in the auction file until its seal could be formally examined. "We have lost," Thomas said quietly. "Not yet." Beatrice watched the bidders surrender their wooden tallies after each successful purchase. Felix's clerk placed them into separate trays, pretending they represented unrelated deposits. Then Beatrice noticed that number 17 bore the same shallow notch along its edge as the tally recovered beside the drainage hut. The notch was not damage. It was a registration cut, made by an auction house, to match each bidder's token with the corresponding entry in a deposit book. Yet, the two number 17 tallies were supposedly issued for different purposes, one to a marsh laborer and one to a London buyer. They could not lawfully share both a number and a registration cut unless they came from the same original batch. Felix had reused auction tokens to pay the men who sabotaged the gates. The destruction of the delivery receipt no longer mattered. The auctioneer was legally required to retain the master deposit book, recording who purchased the batch, how the bidders were funded, and which numbered tallies were issued. Felix believed the tallies were harmless because no one had understood what they truly were. Beatrice turned to the senior commissioner. Before you certify these sales, will you require Mr. Crewe to state under oath that every bidder acted independently and that no auction token was issued to any person employed upon the floodgates? Felix's gaze snapped toward her. I will state it gladly. Beatrice looked at the trays of numbered wood, then at the locked leather case beneath the auctioneer's desk, the only place the master deposit book could be kept. Good, she said. Then tomorrow, at the public certification hearing, I shall give you the opportunity to lie where every person you dispossessed can hear it. Then tomorrow, at the public certification hearing, I shall give you the opportunity to lie where every person you dispossessed can hear it. Beatrice spent the night preparing for that lie, rather than celebrating Felix's unease. Ruth remained in the schoolhouse under the protection of her mother, 2 parish constables, and a crown officer whose name Sir Edmund recorded in writing. Reverend Moore and the frightened copying clerk were placed in separate rooms, so neither could be accused of coordinating testimony. Thomas carried the recovered tally from the drainage hut, while Sir Edmund retained its matching token in a sealed evidence envelope bearing the signatures of the magistrate, the receiver, and 2 villagers. The parish registers were divided among 3 locked chests and transported by separate routes to the county assembly hall. Nathaniel surrendered Felix's letters, debt proposals, and concession drafts to the Crown receiver, but did not participate in Beatrice's reasoning. His role was limited to authenticating the choices he had made and the warnings he had ignored. By 10 o'clock, the assembly hall where Beatrice had first been condemned was crowded again. This time, the displaced Marsh families occupied the front benches. Felix stood beside the auctioneer and the supposed buyers, all dressed as independent merchants. Lenora sat near the commissioners in pale grey silk, presenting herself as a concerned witness rather than an accused conspirator. Beatrice entered in the same teal and ivory gown she had worn during Nathaniel's accusation, though its hem was dark with marsh water and smoke marked one sleeve. She carried no title of office, no estate keys, and no husband's authority. She needed none of them. The senior commissioner opened the hearing by asking Felix to justify certification of the auction. Felix attacked first. He described Ravenshaw as an estate ruined by Beatrice's vanity, unrecorded spending, and reckless interference with qualified engineers. He presented the forged payment note, the page inserted into her father's register, and the vicar's false vacancy certificate. He argued that Nathaniel's retraction arose from marital guilt rather than evidence, and claimed that duplicate tallies had been manufactured by Beatrice's supporters after the sale. His narrative was plausible because it contained fragments of truth. Beatrice had spent money privately. She had cut Felix's rope at North Barrow. She had opened a relief channel that flooded his warehouse, and Nathaniel had concealed serious debts. Lady Beatrice seeks to save her reputation by destroying the only man willing to rescue these tenants from an insolvent duke, Felix concluded. The purchasers before you are independent investors prepared to rebuild the coast. The senior commissioner turned to Beatrice. You may answer. She began not with the flood, but with time. Mr. Crewe, when were the auction tallies issued? Yesterday morning, after the extent of the damage became known. And none existed before the gates opened? None. Were any given to your laborers, inspectors, or agents? No. Do you swear every bidder acted independently and used his own funds? Felix looked directly at her. I do. Beatrice asked Sir Edmund to open the evidence envelope. He displayed tally 17, the one Ruth had delivered before the attack upon the schoolhouse. Thomas then produced the second number 17 token recovered beside the drainage hut hours before the auction was announced. Both bore the same compass emblem, the same registration notch, and a sequence of 3 pinpricks beside the number. The auctioneer leaned forward despite himself. "Those are batch marks," he said. Felix interrupted. "They may have been copied." "Then explain the blue crystals embedded inside the first notch," Beatrice said. Under a magnifying lens, the commissioner saw traces of Eastern gauge dye pressed beneath the cut, rather than spread across its surface. The dye entered the notch when the token was carried to the sabotaged gate. It could not have been added after Sir Edmund sealed it without breaking the wax and altering the custody record. Beatrice next established access. The Eastern gauge had not been forced. It required a Ravenshaw key. Before the public transfer of authority, only Beatrice, the gatekeeper, and Nathaniel possessed authorized keys. Beatrice's key had remained upon her waist until the hearing. The gatekeeper had been struck and left inside the tower. Nathaniel's key was kept in the estate cabinet. "Lady Lenora," Beatrice said, "did you enter the Eastern gauge before my suspension?" Lenora's face remained composed. "Never." "Did you handle its glass chamber?" "No." Nathaniel rose only when the commissioner permitted him. "Before I transferred the coastal keys, I saw blue gauge dye beneath Lady Lenora's cuff. I dismissed my wife's warning." Lenora called the stain ordinary writing powder. Beatrice did not argue. She brought forward the copying clerk, who testified that Josiah Pell had given him the removed glass chamber and ordered him to copy Felix's figures into the engineering register. Reverend Moore then identified Pell as the man who offered £50 for the St. Aldwyn's seal and later abducted him. Ruth described the silver buckle worn by the man who struck her father. Sir Edmund produced her drawing, made before Pell's name became public. A Crown officer placed a buckle recovered from Felix's abandoned warehouse beside it. Both bore the private compass emblem of the distressed property syndicate. Felix claimed Pell had acted alone. Beatrice moved to the physical mechanism. The floodgate teeth recovered from the warehouse matched measurements written in her father's private engineering book, but the barrels had been falsely declared as salt. Felix insisted they were legitimate repair parts. Then why were they used to hold 2 working gates open rather than replace damaged components? She asked. Your men may have misused them without my knowledge, and burned the relief channel with the same linseed oil applied to the false lifting rope. Coincidence. And attacked the parish vestry after learning its records would disprove vacancy. I did not order the fire, and abducted the vicar carrying a duplicate seal prepared before the church burned. Again, Pell. Felix's strategy was now clear. Concede an accomplice and isolate every crime within that man, preserving himself as a deceived employer. Beatrice allowed him to commit to it. She then dismantled the financial trail. The Crown receiver read Nathaniel's letters, showing Felix had demanded control of the marshes before any flooding occurred. The auction deposits appeared to come from 6 merchants, but each bank draft had been purchased on the same afternoon through branches of Crewe Mercantile Credit. 3 bore consecutive cashier numbers. One supposed buyer could not name the acreage he had acquired. Another believed North Barrow was a warehouse rather than a village. The parish registers proved continuous residence, and the drainage assessments proved the tenants had maintained their holdings. Felix had not rescued abandoned land. He had manufactured abandonment, then bid against himself to create the appearance of a lawful market. Lenora rose abruptly. Even if the buyers were connected, that does not prove my brother caused the flood. Lady Beatrice is assembling suspicion and calling it certainty. You are correct, Beatrice said. The decisive question is not who benefited. It is who obtained the tally batch before the disaster, distributed those tokens to the gate saboteurs, and then reused the same numbered pieces at the auction. She turned to the auctioneer. Produce your master deposit book. The man reached beneath his desk and unlocked the leather case. It was empty. Felix's confidence returned, another piece of evidence misplaced under Lady Beatrice's chaotic supervision. But Beatrice had expected the book to disappear. Auction houses send a duplicate batch registration to their London office whenever tokens are issued for a sale exceeding £10,000, she said. The copy records the purchaser, date, total number of tallies, registration cuts, and funding account. At that moment, the doors opened. Nathaniel's trusted groom entered beside an officer from the Crown Receiver's London Bureau. The officer carried a sealed register wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it before the commissioners and displayed the unbroken seals of Holden and Pike, the London Revenue Clerk, and the Crown Post Office. "This is the duplicate registration requested yesterday," he said. "It identifies the person who purchased the entire tally batch 6 weeks before the Ravenshaw flood." The senior commissioner broke the outer seal, opened the register to the marked page, and stared at the name written there. Then he looked not at Felix, but at Lady Lenora Crewe. The senior commissioner broke the outer seal, opened the register to the marked page, and stared at the name written there. Then he looked not at Felix, but at Lady Lenora Crewe. "The batch was purchased 6 weeks ago by Lenora Crewe," he said. A silence moved through the assembly hall, as sharply as a blade. The registration recorded 100 wooden tallies, paid for through an account belonging to the Distressed Property Syndicate. Attached to the entry was a written instruction that 20 tokens be delivered to Josiah Pell at the Crewe warehouse, and the remainder reserved for a private auction at Ravenshaw. Lenora rose. "My brother asked me to place the order. I knew nothing of its purpose." Felix turned toward her. "Say nothing more." His command exposed the control beneath their carefully separated roles. Beatrice stepped before the commissioners. "The date completes the chain. 6 weeks before the flood, Lady Lenora purchased the tokens later carried by the gate saboteurs and the false bidders. At that time, no auction had been announced, no villages had flooded, and no coastal concession existed. Therefore the sale was planned before the disaster it claimed to remedy. The London officer authenticated the registration signatures and matching cuts. The auctioneer confirmed that every token used during the sale belonged to the same batch. Sir Edmund produced tally 17 from his sealed custody, while Thomas presented its blue-stained counterpart from the drainage hut. The commissioners compared their notches to the master pattern and declared them genuine. Felix could no longer isolate the crimes within Josiah Pell. Pell had been paid with a token purchased by Lenora and funded through Felix's syndicate before Nathaniel transferred authority. Reverend Moore testified that Pell demanded a false vacancy certificate. The copying clerk described receiving the removed gauge chamber and inserting Felix's figures into Beatrice's engineering register. Ruth identified Pell's silver buckle, while her father, carried into the hall on a litter under a physician's supervision, confirmed that Pell had struck him after Felix inspected the eastern gate. The gatekeeper also revealed why the blue chamber had been removed. Its dated glass scale would have proved the gate was opened during a falling tide, contradicting the forged report that blamed natural pressure and neglected repairs. Felix's scheme now stood complete. He had stored specially measured iron teeth in barrels declared as salt, bribed Pell's labourers to jam the gates, cut the North Barrow counterweight, and burned the relief ridge to delay Beatrice from diverting the water. Lenora had used her access to Ravenshaw Hall to copy Beatrice's initials, remove Nathaniel's key from the estate cabinet, and handle the eastern gauge before the public accusation. Together, they advanced the Crown inspection, arranged emergency credit, and prepared false vacancy certificates. Once the villages flooded, Felix expected Nathaniel to choose his family's reputation over his wife's warning. Nathaniel's signature would transfer lawful control, allowing the Crews to terminate the tenants' leases, purchase the marsh through false bidders, and monopolize the roads and wharves planned for a future naval supply port. Their fatal error was contempt. They copied old tide tables without checking the moon, used auction tokens to pay saboteurs, placed wet ink inside an engineering register, and assumed no woman publicly disgraced by her husband would retain enough authority to make anyone listen. Lenora attempted one final defense. Nathaniel believed her guilty before I touched a key. His own distrust made every step possible. That is true, Beatrice said. Nathaniel flinched, but she did not spare him to strengthen the case against Lenora. You did not compel him to ignore the impossible lunar date. You did not force him to sign after he saw the wet ink or the mechanisms from Felix's warehouse. You exploited his pride, fear of insolvency, and willingness to value the Ravenshaw name above the person protecting it. The scheme belongs to you. The betrayal belongs to him. Nathaniel stood before the same tenants who had witnessed Beatrice's humiliation. My wife warned me repeatedly, he said. I refused investigation when I possessed both the time and evidence to order it. I removed her authority, gave her accusers access to the coast, swore a complaint I could not honestly support, and signed the deed that enabled these seizures. Lady Beatrice did not endanger Ravenshaw. She preserved it while I endangered her, our tenants, and the truth. He formally withdrew every accusation and surrendered his remaining coastal powers to the Crown Receiver pending parliamentary and judicial review. The commissioners voided certification of the auction because the buyers were not independent and the vacancy claims were fraudulent. Felix and Lenora were taken into custody for conspiracy to defraud, destruction of records, arson, kidnapping, assault, and interference with Crown revenues. Josiah Pell was arrested 2 days later while attempting to board a packet boat under a false name. The copying clerk received protection in exchange for testimony, though he remained answerable for forgery. The false concession was suspended. Felix's warehouses and syndicate accounts were seized, and those assets were placed toward repairing the gates and compensating the displaced families. Nathaniel's consequence remained separate. The Crown receivership continued over Ravenshaw's coastal income. His shipping interests were sold to satisfy the debts he had concealed, and he lost the authority his wife had once helped him preserve. He instructed his solicitor and Beatrice's marriage settlement trustees to restore every pound of her private allowance spent upon estate defences with interest, and placed an additional unentailed property at Ashcombe under a trust for her independent residence and income. He also signed binding agreements guaranteeing the marsh tenants' long leases, compensation for flood damage, and representation in future drainage decisions. None of those actions purchased forgiveness. 3 months later, the rebuilt Eastern Gauge stood above repaired fields, its new glass chamber marked with dates calculated by Beatrice. The Crown appointed her independent superintendent of the Ravenshaw Coastal Trust, answerable to the commissioners and tenant board, rather than to Nathaniel. At the first public meeting, Nathaniel approached carrying the iron key she had surrendered on the night of the flood. This should never have been taken from you, he said. Beatrice did not accept it from his hand. She nodded toward Ruth Bell, now serving as junior keeper beside her recovering father. Nathaniel understood and placed the key upon the commissioner's table. Ruth lifted it and presented it formally to Beatrice under the new trust seal. The reversed gesture mattered. Nathaniel could return an object, but he could not restore authority as though it still belonged to him. Beatrice accepted the key from the institution she had helped build. Nathaniel asked for neither reconciliation nor absolution. He would remain at Ravenshaw Hall under financial supervision, while Beatrice established her residence at Ashcombe and continued directing the coastal repairs. She agreed only that he might write to her once each month, and that any future meeting would occur by her invitation. It was not forgiveness, but neither was it a promise that forgiveness could never exist. On the morning the final families returned to Lower Mere, Beatrice walked to the eastern gate, wearing a teal cloak over her ivory gown. Nathaniel stood among the tenants rather than before them. When the tide reached the correct mark, Ruth handed Beatrice the iron key. Beatrice fitted it into the restored mechanism, turned it with both hands, and closed the gate against the rising sea.